Hey everybody, hope you're all doing well out there. Today I want to talk about Chinese motorcycles a little bit, and particularly the larger CCs. If you're new to my channel and you don't know, I started out with a Chinese 125 like 15 years ago when they were really not very good. And since then I got a newer one, and then I got my bigger bikes, but I continued to review Chinese bikes for years and years and years, and I even had a hand in the development of a couple of them. Like, it gave my feedback to the point that the company acknowledged that they used my feedback to upgrade the bikes. I spent years talking to people within the industry, asking questions, trying to learn more about it. I mean, simply, when I got my first Chinese bike 15 years ago, it cost me 1,400 quid, and it did everything I wanted it to do, and it taught me how to fix a bike. Let's just say that much. But it was good. I didn't have a problem with it at that price. At the time when people had an opinion of them that they weren't as good as a Japanese bike, it was true. They weren't as good, but they were not anywhere near the same price. And as years have gone on, the Japanese bikes are made in China and everywhere else and not Japan, and the price of those has gone up and up. But in that time, the Chinese bikes have, yes, they've gone up in price, but they've also massively increased in quality, to the point that now where Japanese came down and Chinese came up, those recent Zenith SMR and the SMXE that I reviewed, the quality of those, it's on par with some of the Japanese bikes. And as I say, the reason I'm saying Japanese is because no 125 is made in Japan anymore. They're just not. In fact, lots of bikes aren't made in Japan anymore. It's lots of other countries, China, Thailand, lots of places. If you want to know where your bike was made, because if you're like, I've got an Aprilia, so it was made in Italy, right? It says made in Italy. Just go to your frame number and go into a website called whomademybike.com or something like that, and you put the frame number in and it will give you what country and factory it was made in. If it was an Aprilia, depending on the year, it was probably made in France, not Italy. And in some other cases made in lots of other different countries. There's another aspect to this with Chinese bikes that I should mention if you're not aware of it, which is that, and people get confused by this a lot clearly, I'll review a Lex Moto or something and they'll say this is just a rebadged and name another brand that sells that bike. Like that one was the original, but this one is a copy. Those people fundamentally do not understand how Chinese motorcycles are manufactured or how they come to be, as it were. So basically in China you'll have a factory which will produce bikes, and then people will buy those bikes from them, and you can ask them, the company, you can approach the factory and say, I'd like that bike, I'd like it in orange, white and blue, I'd like this sticker kit on it, I'd like you to put this name on it, and they'll sell it to you. And now the original Pulse Adrenaline was a Quongi, something like that, and then that was sold to like 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 different companies, and in different countries with different CCs and different names, but it was the same bike from the same factory, and people have an argument saying, well, that one's rubbish, but this one's good, and it's like, it is literally the same bike with different stickers on it. There are some quality differences sometimes towards these days, but in the past they were just clones. Also, when a big brand picks up one of these Chinese bikes and sells it, people assume that it is their bike and everyone else is copying. And a good example of this is the Aprilia, it's like the RX 125 or something. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head right now. It's the dirt bike. If you look up DSR 125cc, it's literally the same bike. This is not copying Aprilia. This is Aprilia and buying from the same company and selling the same bike. It was at a certain time they were basically identical. Maybe a couple of small changes here and there, but they were the same bike. But of course everyone then says, oh, well, the Aprilia was the original. It wasn't. That's just the way that Chinese bikes work. Of course, there is a lot of people who will just say that Chinese is rubbish and you shouldn't go and get Chinese, go and get Japanese. The same thing happened many years ago with British bikes and Japanese bikes. People said that the Japanese bikes were rubbish, but in the end people realised they were more reliable, faster and cheaper, I think, and they completely overtook the entire market to the point that everyone now says you should get a Japanese bike. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen with China, because the difference between Britain and Japan at the time of bikes was that the Japanese were making better bikes. The Chinese don't make better bikes than the big brands. They make facsimiles of those bikes with lower stats for lower prices, and that's completely fine. As I've said, a bike to get you from A to B doesn't need to be absolutely ridiculous. It can just be a basic bike, and it doesn't cost you like 4.5, 5 grand necessarily to get it. Of course, then what people say is, well, yeah, but with the Japanese brand, you're going to get better build quality, and you're going to get better steel, and you're going to get better quality control. The steel's from the same place when they're made in China. the quality control is the same. They may have an overseer in the factory, but I've spoken to people who have visited these factories and said it is no different. In some cases, it's the same production lines and they just change casings. So don't always believe what's said. And a lot of people will parrot a lot of stuff and it's just not true. So that's kind of like, you know, the basis of Chinese bikes. I'm not saying they're the best in the world, and nowadays with the price of them going up, their appeal is coming down a bit, especially when you consider the second-hand market. But as I've always said with 125s, I'd rather buy new than second-hand, because the second-hand market 125s is probably the most lemon-filled, ticking time bomb-filled section of the bike trader ads, because the people who buy them, on average, are new. They don't know how to ride sometimes, so they can be very hard on the bikes. They can ride the ever-living crap out of them because they want it to be a 500. They crash them a lot, they drop them a lot because they're learning on them, and they also don't necessarily do all the maintenance like they should because they don't know how to, or they only go to a garage to get it done, so they don't get oil changes nearly as often as they should because they can't afford to. Big point of why I have all those videos on teaching you how to do stuff to your own bike. So while it is entirely true that you can go to the second-hand market and buy a second-hand Japanese bike cheaper than a new Chinese at these days, definitely, because you know the prices of the Chinese have come up. But then again, a second-hand Chinese is also still the same thing, but it's even cheaper, but you don't get the warranty and stuff that comes with it. But they're so simple to fix and they're really easy to fix, generally. So I really needed to point all that stuff out at the beginning if you don't know about Chinese bikes, because the amount of misconceptions that exist about them is huge. Anyway, even with all of that, in the past 10 years or so, Chinese bikes have gone from being, you know, a small percentage of the market to quite a large percentage of the market. You now see lots of them out and about in the 125cc category, but you do not see them as larger CCs generally. Now, the first larger CC bike that China was trying to get into the UK that I am aware of and had interactions with was when I had my Pulse Adrenaline. They were actually... Someone was testing out a 250 engine which was being put inside one of those, and they actually came to one of my meets and they were like, oh look, that's the 250. They're doing like prototyping and testing this. Well, it didn't work very well with the setup they had, because the carb on it, when they put the throttle on, you could actually see it being sucked towards the engine. It really wasn't set up right. That was one of the first instances. They did eventually bring that bike out and it flopped hard, as far as I can tell. Since then, you've had things like the LXR 380, which I haven't ever seen any out on the street. I think a few people have them, but I don't think it did very well. There was also the Lexmoto Vendetta 250. Now, that thing stands out differently to me. That thing was awesome. I really love the engine and the sound and everything about that bike, and I actually kind of want one. I know it was really small for me, but I don't have space for it, and logistically it wouldn't make much sense to have one, but I do really like the Vendetta 250. And it did okay with certain people, but they were always older. That and a few other bits is why I'm getting to this point of why China is struggling with larger than 125cc bikes and is going to have problems if they don't change their ways. With the larger cc bikes, you're going from 125 up to an A2. So if you've got an A2, the first thing you want is all of the power, most people. You know, people who buy between 125 up to about 500 generally are on an A2, or they tend to be older and they don't want a fast bike, they just want an A to B bike. This is what I know from talking to people. You know, 250s, 350s, 400s, things like that. The older generations really enjoy, because it's, you know, a trip back to biking, but without tons of speed and more like the old days. That's what I'm told anyway. But that's a small group of people. When you're trying to get the A2ers, the new young people on board, you really need to give them everything they want. Like Sinis did with the SMR, where they've gone for the full brake horsepower limit for a CBT. They've gone for ABS and stuff like that, and water cooling. They've really tried to hit all those key figures that people want. And in the A2 market, those key figures, again, are power and stuff. And the offerings so far, including the 380, have not been close to that power limit. There are a few examples, of course, which are actually doing quite well, but at the moment, there isn't a huge amount of Chinese larger CC bikes out there, and they never seem to do that well. Now, going back to what I was saying earlier on about the second-hand market, when it comes to a above 125cc, the second-hand market is not nearly as dangerous in my eyes, because the people who have those bikes they've spent more money on them, they tend to look after them better, they've learnt how to do things, you know, how to change oil and that sort of stuff. Not always, because, you know, some people go straight to A2, but there is the opportunity for people to have been on a bike for a few years and know how to look after it. So they tend to be better, more honest bikes, and not such a, you know, a minefield of lemons, as it were. And this is where it all comes to a head for the larger CC Chinese bikes, because say I'm someone who's just passed my A2 license and I want to look for a bike. I've got the options of getting a brand new Chinese bike, yes. They do make some that are closer to the power limit, because as I say, it's what people want, power limit, when they get an A2, because they've just got a bigger license to get a bigger bike. And let's face it, A2's 48 brake horsepower is not a huge amount, so they want as much of it as they can possibly get. But when you're going to buy a bike, you've got an option between a new Chinese bike or used Japanese bikes. And when it becomes over 125cc, Japanese is a little truer. Some are actually made in Japan still. Not a huge amount, but there is a definite difference in quality between the 125s that Japan make, because they're subcontracted off to other companies. If you didn't know, they don't make them themselves. When I say they're made in other countries, and you know, it's not them that's making them. There's a Honda 125 which is made in China, just down the road from where like Lex Moto bikes are made, and it's in a factory which normally makes air conditioning. But people will call that Japanese, opposed to the one that's Chinese, which is built in the same area by a motorcycle factory that's been going for a very long time, compared to an air conditioning factory, to my understanding, to be clear. Why would someone choose to go for a new Chinese bike over a second-hand Japanese bike? Warranty, maybe. You know, you get a couple of years warranty, parts and servicing, stuff like that. But then when it comes to the second-hand market, Japanese bike, it's older, it's done the miles it's done. You can look at it, and you know, generally it's not going to just suddenly start falling apart on you. If it's made it through its first couple of years without too many problems, you know, it's probably going to be all right. So I completely understand why people would say I would never buy a larger CC Chinese bike opposed to a second-hand Japanese one. It makes total sense. And the reason that is, and this is the core of so many of China's problems when it comes to these things, is that they obviously just steal everyone else's designs. Every single motorcycle that China makes pretty much either looks like a Japanese bike, or it looks like a culmination of 2 or 3 Japanese bikes, and that's the really clever one, because no one can sue you. It's like plagiarise 3 people, and then they have to fight between themselves to just say who has the most of the plagiarism to be able to sue you and get their money, or maybe they do. It just doesn't happen anyway, because this is China, and like with the case of things like the Landwind, which was the Land Rover rip-off, they just go, when it goes to court, they just go, nah, it doesn't look anything like it. Literal clone, doesn't look anything like it. There are lots more problems, obviously, about China, and I always do very much sometimes get conflicted about the whole, like, you know, these bikes come from that country, maybe that's not a great thing, but at the same time, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of other stuff does too. It's the same as people who say, I won't ever want to have an 18650 in my house, and you're like, are you on a laptop? It's full of them. People just don't know. Ignorance. As I said on Twitter recently, isn't it funny the most outraged people tend to be the most ill-informed? And this is the problem. As I say, if I'm like a new rider and I'm going out there to get a bike, in the 125cc market, the fact that they're trying to look like other bikes doesn't really matter. It's the usability and stuff, and that is still winning out. Even though the price has got a lot higher, it's still winning out in my mind. Beyond this, it never has done. The only way that China is going to sell larger CC bikes and be successful as they have been with the 125s is if they either make them much cheaper without increasing the quality, making them much better quality at slightly, well, maybe the same price, or, and it sounds crazy, make your own bikes. Design your own bikes. You have the ability to clone people's stuff, which means you have the ability to design stuff, but it's like the originality, the idea of the thing is never actually China's. It reminds me of a story like many years ago in China. I think it was something like some university or design university or something like that, and they'd made this promotional video about it, and then like the lead of the university realised that they'd completely ripped off someone else's video, shot for shot almost, and he was like, "This is China's problem. We were not brave enough to take the risk to be original, to come up with our own ideas, rather than looking at what's successful and copying it." But then again, you'll see this with many things. You know, look at Russian military equipment. It's all just a clone of the American stuff and other people's stuff, generally. Don't want to get into that whole debate. Just saying this is true. There's a lot of copycat stuff going on. People develop stuff and then people copy it. You know, when it comes to the military stuff, okay, maybe that makes some sense because you're trying to head off each other. Although you're probably always going to be on a disadvantage if you're copying what they have. But anyway, yeah, with China, I believe that they could come up with some cool ideas. And when they make a bike which is a reasonable price and is also different, you can't find a Japanese equivalent. You know, it's not an obvious clone of this, this and this, or this one bike. Once they get the option to actually get something that's original, they might go for it. The thing is, in copying these bikes, it's like they're trying to copy the look and not the performance or the feel. Like they'll do some, you know, the Chinese bikes are always very good, but they've always got some weird things about them. Like the Sinus I just had, you know, the engine's great, but the gearing on it is just a bit odd. And there was always that one thing that's a bit odd or strange, and it's slightly more raked out than it should be. And you know, it feels like the company that designed that didn't really put as much thought into it as maybe Honda did to set up a chassis to be really good at handling. And that's kind of the problem with copying people and not trying to make something good yourself. Of course, it's true that they may actually do this and then only sell them in places like China. They may never bring them over to the UK. I don't know on that side of it exactly. I mean, there are millions of different types of bikes that you can just mail order from China with your name on it and become a brand. You know, all I would need is a good wedge of cash, and I could go to one of these Chinese companies and I could say, yep, I want that bike in that model and I want these things. If you're a big enough customer buying enough things, you can normally do something like say, I want exclusivity over this model, or I want exclusivity over this model in these colours, and that has definitely happened between two UK-based Chinese companies who sell the same bike. You'll notice that one of them doesn't ever come in black, and the other one always does, because they have the rights to the black one, and the other side don't, but they can still have the same bike. There's so much stuff like this. But yeah, everything that ends up here ends up being a copy of something. Like, look at all the Chinese Grom copies, like the Bullet and the Lex Moto. You know, they've got a trellis frame. To my understanding, that is plastic fascia piece that is screwed on to make it look like it has a trellis frame. Just don't do that. Don't try and make it look like something else. Just make it a bike. Simple and true. A to B. Good little engine, good gearbox, good brakes, that sort of stuff. You know, styling a bike is not even that difficult, I don't think. I mean, of course, this is the problem like with music, that you make a tune and it sounds kind of like that, and now instantly when you make a bike that's kind of like, looks like a dirt bike, people go, well, that's clearly the Yamaha. That's clearly this, and to different people it's different things. But yeah, if they made a bike that looked super, super, super cool, and it was reasonable quality and a really great price, and it looked unique, people wouldn't go, it's Chinese, because they wouldn't be able to have an option of the Japanese. So like, oh, I don't want the Chinese one, I'll get the Japanese one. If it was just what it is, you know, it's like how I review bikes. I review things for what they are and not what they're not. It could be great and they could sell many. Anyway, I'm going to end this video there. If you did enjoy this video, please hit the like button. If you'd like to add anything in the comments, start a discussion on anything, ask any questions, go ahead and do that. If you want to help support this channel, please consider doing that through Patreon. That is the only way this channel stays completely independent and honest. You know, some of the bike companies I work with maybe wouldn't like that I talk about Chinese bikes on a whole like this, but it's the truth, and there's no point hiding from it. Catch you in the next one. Bye bye.